secretly engaged to his fiancée Mina, Harker is on his way to Transylvania to complete a deal with Count Dracula, who is buying property in London. On his journey, Harker immediately feels something eerie and supernatural, since so many of the local peasants try to stop him from going and offer him crucifixes for protection from a painful death. When he finally reaches Castle Dracula, Harker's fears begin to shrink at the warm, hospitable greeting from Dracula. He seems like a well-cultured, educated, and kind man. Soon, however, Jonathan notices Dracula's cold, dead hands and exceptionally sharp teeth, bringing back his fears and suspicions. Over the next few days, Harker finds that the Count is actually holding him prisoner, only keeping him alive until the transaction of London property is complete. After almost getting eaten by vampire brides, watching the brides eat a dead baby, getting his distress that is burned before his eyes, witnessing Dracula's supernatural powers, and nearly having his throat torn out while shaving, Jonathan has lost his sanity and wants nothing more than to return to Mina in London or else die. He takes the risk to climb down the castle walls in order to escape. Back in England, Mina Murray, who is training to be a schoolmistress, exchanges letters with her best friend Louis Westenra, who is training to marry. Mina tells Lucy how excited she is to see Jonathan again, while Lucy tells Mina of her 3 marriage proposals in a single day. One from the royal gentleman Arthur Holmwood, the psychologist and doctor John Seward, and brave American Quincy Morris. She accepts Arthur's. While in Whitby, Lucy and Mina read about a mysterious ship that crashed ashore with 50 boxes of Transylvanian dirt, a dead boat captain, and a dog that runs off. This boat carried Dracula from Transylvania to England, where he plans to feed on young women's blood. Soon after this, Lucy begins to sleepwalk uncontrollably. One night, she walks out into a cemetery and encounters Dracula, who sucks her blood. Soon after, Lucy starts getting a fever, losing blood, and acting sexily. Dr. Seward is unable to diagnose what caused her problem, so he calls up Van Helsing, an expert on abstract diseases. While Mina is out marrying Jonathan, Van Helsing, Arthur Seward, and Quincy give Lucy numerous blood transfusions to deal with her mysterious loss of blood. Van Helsing, the only person who knows that Dracula is sucking Lucy's blood, puts garlic in her room to protect her. However, the moment she begins to make any recovery, a wolf sent by Dracula breaks into her room and allows Dracula to finish her off, initiating her transformation into a vampire. Although it required him to take the men to Lucy's grave and witness her voluptuous undead alter ego, Van Helsing finally proves to Arthur, Quincy, and Seward that the beautiful woman they once loved is a vampire that's been kidnapping children and injuring them. Only once they stake her and cut off her head can she be at rest. After Arthur does the business, the 4 men unite with the newly married Harkers and vow to hunt down Dracula.
The men decide to go look in the Carfax house next to the asylum and see if Dracula's boxes of earth are there, but they're first called in to see Renfield, who warns them that something bad will happen. The men still go to Carfax, where they find 29 of the 50 boxes. When Jonathan returns home, he notices that Mina looks pale. The next day, Mina says that she had weird dreams the previous night, so she asks for a sleeping aid from Seward, which makes her fall asleep. That day, though, Jonathan found out that 9 of Dracula's boxes had been moved to a house in Piccadilly. He also gets a lawyer to confirm that the house had been bought by a foreign man named Count de Ville. Seward later gets a message that Renfield is covered in blood from a bad accident. Renfield tells Seward and Van Helsing that Dracula was the one who had hurt him. Renfield explains that he had been letting Dracula into the asylum, but when Renfield saw that Mina looked pale earlier, he had tried to stop Dracula from coming in again. That's when Dracula hurt him to get in. Since Seward and Van Helsing now know that Dracula is after Mina, they rush to her room and find Jonathan unconscious and Mina drinking blood from a cut in Dracula's chest. Dracula disappears, and Mina explains that she felt drawn to Dracula and that he had told her that she was in his power now. The men plan to go to Carfax and Piccadilly and sterilize all of the boxes there with holy water. Before they leave, Van Helsing wants to make sure Mina is safe, so he blesses her with a holy wafer, but it burns her forehead and leaves a mark. The men still go and sterilize the boxes at Carfax, but when they go to Piccadilly, they find that one of the boxes is missing. Then, Mina sends a telegram that she has seen Dracula leaving Carfax. The men get their anti-vampire weapons ready, and Dracula appears. He avoids being hurt by the men and escapes, but reminds them that he has control over Mina. The men go home to Mina, and Van Helsing hypnotizes her and realizes that through Mina's connection with Dracula, they can figure out what Dracula is doing, and they can find out that Dracula is on a ship called the Tsarina Catherine. The men decide to follow the ship by taking a train across Europe, and Mina makes them take her along on the journey so that she can be watched over and Dracula can't summon her. The group travels to Varna and waits for Dracula's ship to arrive. Throughout this time, the men hypnotize Mina to track Dracula's whereabouts. After waiting for many days, they receive word that Dracula's ship docked in the port in Galatz. However, Dracula has lessened his control over Mina so that the men can't track him anymore, and they have to now guess where he is going. The group arrives at Galatz and talks to the captain of the ship that Dracula had been on, who says that someone picked up the box labeled Count Dracula. Mina figures out that the box was sent down the Sereth River, which runs close to Castle Dracula. The group splits up and heads to the castle in different ways. Mina and Van Helsing travel together by horse-drawn carriage, and Van Helsing notices that she becomes more and more like a vampire. When the two are close to the castle, Van Helsing stops the carriage and puts Mina in a protective circle, and he sees the three sexy vampire ladies. The next morning, he leaves sleeping Mina in the protective circle, finds the vampire ladies, and kills them the way that Arthur killed Lucy. Van Helsing goes back to Mina, who has woken up, and they see a group of gypsies in a wagon heading to the castle. Quincy, Jonathan, Arthur, and Seward try to break through the group to get to the wagon, and Quincy is stabbed. The box holding Dracula falls out of the wagon, and Harker and Quincy kill him. Dracula's body turns into dust. Then the scar on Mina's forehead disappears, and Quincy dies. 7 years later, Mina and Jonathan have a son, who they name Quincy, and Arthur and Dr. Seward have both gotten married.
In Dracula's eyes, the peasants in Transylvania are stupid and poor and can only survive if a ruler is present to govern and make decisions for them. This statement supports the idea of monarchy because in a monarchy, a single ruler controls a large group of people. In Harker's case, he loses respect for the peasants when they begin to make claims about vampires and werewolves, again showing the need for monarchy, as citizens are too stupid to govern themselves. However, the peasants turn out to be right about the sighting of vampires, and their respect is regained. This supports democracy, as even though it seemed as if the peasants were extremely unintelligent, they turn out to be right and therefore smart enough to govern themselves.
For a traditional woman, we have Lucy. She's physically pretty and emotional. She just wants to have kids and get married and have a family life. But we have a modern woman who is Mina. She's useful and intellectual, and she's described as having a man's brain, but in reality, she's just more independent and educated, and most women aren't back then. The main difference between these two is how they're connected with Dracula. Lucy is used by Dracula to make minions, basically, and Mina uses Dracula to find him and track him down.
During this time, many people move into London, bringing with them disease and a new set of genes into the population. The current citizens of London are appalled at this change and feel that the purity of the people is threatened by the bad immigrants moving into their lands. An example of a bad immigrant would be Dracula, as he kills civilians and takes innocent babies. However, the British failed to realize that in reality, a huge segment of the British population are immigrants from Ireland, and not all immigrants are bad either. Quincy, an American, is an example of a good immigrant, as he helps the vampire hunters kill Dracula.
At this time, England was struggling with the growing pains of industrialization. Although many people felt the need to stay loyal to traditional religious beliefs, an increasing amount was turning to the new technology of the day. A perfect example of this in Dracula is Van Helsing's use of religious artifacts to fight the vampire, combined with his use of cutting-edge medical operations such as blood transfusions to keep Lucy alive. The theme that Stoker was trying to get across is that both these methods were successful and that technology and religion can successfully coexist. Abraham Stoker, frequently called Bram Stoker, was an Irish author best known for his classic horror novel Dracula. Stoker was born in Dublin, Ireland on November 8, 1847. As a child, Stoker was frequently sick and his mother would tell him horror stories. This possibly inspired him to write horror stories later on in life. In 1864, Stoker enrolled at the Trinity College in Dublin and graduated in 1870. Early on in his adult life, Stoker worked as a civil servant at the Dublin Castle. While working at the castle, he was also an unpaid writer for the local newspaper. After working in the civil service for 10 years, Stoker was granted a management position at the Lyceum Theatre by his new friend, an English actor named Sir Henry Irving. This job was a turning point for Stoker. He was inspired by his travels and exposure to the arts and began publishing books. In 1897, he published his most popular horror story and masterpiece, Dracula. Dracula has inspired many theatrical, literary, and film interpretations. Stoker died in London, England on April 20th, 1912. Stoker wrote a total of 18 books in his lifetime.
Epistolary literature was a popular form of writing novels in the 18th and 19th centuries. The word epistolary is derived from the Greek word epistle, which means letter. So the author would use letters, journals, and varying documents to tell their stories. This form gained prominence with Samuel Richardson's Pamela in 1740. The epistolary format allows the author to tell a story from multiple first-hand points of view and also presents a closer and more personal perspective of a character, including their sometimes hidden fears, desires, and knowledge. This facilitation of intimate emotion was especially important during the post-Romantic Victoria era in England, which valued deep emotion. In Dracula, Bram Stoker used the epistolary format very effectively. The entire novel is comprised of letters, diary entries, doctor's notes, telegrams, and so on. Thus, Stoker masterfully presents varying personal sentiments. For example, in his diary, Stewart expresses his disbelief that Lucy has been attacking children, for he still believes that she's fully dead. He is even further appalled at the idea of cutting off her head in order to sterilize her. In contrast, a letter from Van Helsing presents the reader his personal perspective on the urgent necessity of destroying Lucy, for he knows the dangerous potential of the undead. The epistolary style allows the reader to follow Stewart's progression of thoughts and Van Helsing's experience with the undead.
Dracula was published in 1897, just before the turn of the century. 19th century Great Britain saw many political, economic, and social changes due to industrialization. Politically, the new wealthy, upper-middle-class factory owners began to gain power in Parliament, shifting away from the traditional aristocrats. Economically, Great Britain became the global leader in coal manufacturing, along with most other metals, furs, wool, and many foods. Socially, a new class began to form. The upper middle class consisted of wealthy landowners made rich by the factories they owned. This new class spent their money in a way that led to an increase in mass leisure, thus popularizing many forms of entertainment.
Dracula had a huge impact on culture. It's very popular from the beginning, and it's not the first vampire story ever made. Why was it so popular? Because it had the perfect mix of drama, sex, romance, blood, death, all of that, horror, anything you can want from a story. And more than 200 films were made featuring Dracula afterwards, only second to Sherlock Holmes.